Before we embark on this extraordinary journey through one of history's most fascinating and consequential periods, I invite you to join our growing community of history enthusiasts. Please take a moment to like this video if you find it enlightening, subscribe to our channel for more incredible historical documentaries, and don't forget to leave a comment telling us where in the world you're watching from. We love connecting with our global audience. Now, let's step back in time to witness the dramatic consequences that befell those who dared to refuse the mighty Viking alliances. The year was 865, and across the vast expanse of medieval Europe, a sophisticated network of political alliances was taking shape that would fundamentally alter the trajectory of Western civilization. Contrary to popular misconceptions of Vikings as mere raiders and pillagers, these Norse leaders were astute politicians who understood that lasting power came not just from the edge of a sword, but from the careful cultivation of diplomatic relationships that spanned continents. Viking diplomacy during the 9th and 10th centuries represented a complex tapestry of gift exchange, strategic marriages, and carefully negotiated treaties that rivaled the sophistication of any contemporary European court. The Norse rulers, from the legendary Harald Bluetooth to the formidable Canute the Great, operated within an intricate system where political alliances served as the foundation for territorial expansion, trade networks, and cultural integration. These diplomatic endeavors extended far beyond simple military pacts, encompassing economic agreements that established trade routes stretching from Greenland to Constantinople, fostering cultural exchanges that would influence European development for centuries to come. The Viking approach to alliance building was multifaceted and remarkably modern in its strategic thinking. Gift exchange formed the cornerstone of their diplomatic protocol, with precious metals, exotic goods, and finely crafted weapons serving not merely as tokens of goodwill, but as symbols of political commitment and mutual obligation. These gifts carried profound symbolic meaning, representing the giver's status within the complex hierarchy of medieval European politics, and serving as tangible evidence of the strength and reliability of proposed alliances. The practice of fostering noble children in foreign courts created networks of cross-cultural connections that transcended simple political expediency, establishing bonds that could influence diplomatic decisions for generations. Marriage alliances represented perhaps the most sophisticated aspect of Viking diplomatic strategy, cementing political relationships through carefully orchestrated unions between Norse nobility and foreign royal families. These strategic marriages resulted in profound cultural exchange and the blending of traditions, often involving complex negotiations regarding dowries, inheritance rights, and the future political alignment of offspring. The marriage of Rollo of Normandy to Gisela of France exemplified this approach, transforming a Viking warlord into a French duke and establishing the Norman dynasty that would eventually reshape English history. However, within this elaborate system of diplomatic protocol lay an unforgiving reality. Rejection of Viking overtures carried consequences that extended far beyond simple political disagreement. The Norse approach to diplomacy operated on principles of reciprocity and honor that demanded responses to offers of alliance, tribute, or territorial arrangement. When European rulers chose to decline these carefully crafted diplomatic initiatives, they often found themselves facing not just military retaliation, but systematic campaigns designed to demonstrate the futility of resistance to Viking political objectives. The consequences of refusing Viking alliances manifested in multiple devastating forms that went far beyond conventional military defeat. Economic isolation became a primary tool of retaliation, as Viking control over crucial trade routes meant that kingdoms rejecting Norse partnerships often found themselves cut off from essential commercial networks that had sustained their prosperity for generations. The Vikings' mastery of maritime technology and their extensive knowledge of European waterways allowed them to implement effective blockades that could strangle the economic lifelines of defiant kingdoms. Political destabilization represented another frightening consequence of rejecting Viking diplomatic overtures. The Norse possessed an intricate understanding of European political dynamics, and was skilled at exploiting internal divisions within kingdoms that had spurned their alliance proposals. Through careful intelligence gathering and strategic support of rival claimants to thrones, Viking leaders could orchestrate civil conflicts that would weaken their targets far more effectively than direct military assault. This approach allowed them to achieve their political objectives while expending minimal resources and avoiding the risks associated with large-scale military campaigns. The systematic nature of Viking retaliation extended to cultural and religious warfare that sought to undermine the very foundations of resistant kingdoms. Understanding that medieval European rulers derived much of their legitimacy from Christian authority and religious tradition, Viking forces often targeted religious centers, monasteries, and cultural institutions in their campaigns against those who had rejected their diplomatic advances. This strategy served the dual purpose of weakening enemy morale, while demonstrating the inability of Christian kings to protect their most sacred institutions. As we shall discover in the remarkable story of King Edmund of East Anglia, the price of refusing Viking alliance proposals could escalate to levels of personal and political destruction that contemporary medieval rulers found almost incomprehensible. The transformation of a prosperous kingdom into a cautionary tale would serve as a stark reminder to other European monarchs of the terrible consequences that awaited those who dared to challenge the expanding Norse political network that was reshaping the medieval world. The saga of King Edmund of East Anglia stands as perhaps the most dramatic and terrifying example of what befell medieval rulers who dared to refuse Viking alliance proposals. In the autumn of 869, when the great heathen army under the leadership of Ivar the Boneless swept across East Anglia, King Edmund faced a choice that would determine not only his personal fate but the destiny of his entire kingdom. The young Christian monarch, ruling over one of Anglo-Saxon England's most prosperous territories, would soon discover that political defiance against the Norse diplomatic machine carried consequences more severe than anything medieval Europe had previously witnessed. Ivar the Boneless, whose reputation for both military genius and diplomatic cunning had spread throughout northern Europe, approached the conquest of East Anglia with characteristic strategic sophistication. Rather than immediately launching a devastating military assault, Ivar first sent emissaries to King Edmund with an offer that, on its surface, appeared remarkably generous. The terms proposed by the Viking leader would have allowed Edmund to retain his crown and continue ruling his people, but only as a client king under Norse suzerainty, sharing power with pagan Viking administrators and abandoning his Christian principles in favor of accommodating Norse religious practices. The diplomatic proposition presented to Edmund represented a carefully calculated test of his political flexibility and religious commitment. Ivar understood that successful integration of conquered territories required the cooperation of existing power structures, and his offer to Edmund reflected the sophisticated political thinking that characterized Viking expansion throughout Europe. The terms would have preserved much of the existing governmental framework while ensuring Viking control over strategic resources and military capabilities. For a pragmatic ruler facing overwhelming military odds, acceptance might have seemed the prudent course of action. However, King Edmund's response revealed the profound religious and cultural convictions that would ultimately seal his fate and transform him into a symbol of resistance against Norse expansion. According to contemporary accounts preserved in the writings of Abbo of Fleury and later chronicled by Alfric of Eynsham, Edmund's reply to Ivar's messenger demonstrated unwavering commitment to his Christian faith and rejection of any compromise with pagan authority. The king reportedly declared that he would not defile his hands with the blood of his people through collaboration with heathen rulers, choosing instead to follow Christ's example even unto death. The king's categorical rejection of the Viking alliance proposal triggered a response from Ivar that would become legendary for its calculated cruelty and symbolic significance. Rather than simply ordering Edmund's execution through conventional means, Ivar orchestrated a public demonstration of what awaited rulers who dared to challenge Viking political supremacy. The elaborate ritual of torment that followed served multiple purposes. It satisfied Norse concepts of honor and revenge, provided a spectacular warning to other potential resistors, and demonstrated the futility of relying on Christian faith as protection against Viking determination. The systematic destruction of King Edmund became a carefully choreographed spectacle designed to maximize psychological impact on both immediate witnesses and future generations of European rulers. Contemporary accounts describe how Edmund was bound to an ancient oak tree, a detail that carried profound symbolic significance in both Christian and pagan traditions. The use of arrows in the initial phase of torment evoked imagery from both Norse hunting rituals and Christian martyrdom narratives, creating a complex cultural dialogue that resonated across religious boundaries. The final beheading represented not merely execution, but the complete severing of the connection between the king and his kingdom, symbolically destroying the royal authority that had dared to challenge Viking supremacy. The immediate aftermath of King Edmund's martyrdom revealed the devastating efficiency with which Viking forces could dismantle the entire political and social structure of a resistant kingdom. East Anglia, which had been among the most prosperous and stable of the Anglo-Saxon territories, was systematically stripped of its wealth, administrative capacity, and cultural institutions. The Vikings destroyed contemporary records and documentation, effectively erasing evidence of Edmund's reign and the kingdom's former independence. This deliberate obliteration of historical memory served as both practical military strategy and psychological warfare, demonstrating that resistance to Viking alliance proposals could result in complete cultural annihilation. The installation of puppet rulers in the wake of Edmund's destruction became a standard component of Viking retaliation against kingdoms that had rejected diplomatic overtures. These client kings, chosen specifically for their willingness to collaborate with Norse authorities, served as living examples of the alternative that had been available to the martyred monarch. The contrast between Edmund's fate and the relative prosperity enjoyed by compliant rulers created a powerful demonstration of the rewards and punishments associated with different responses to Viking alliance proposals. The long-term consequences of Edmund's refusal to accept Viking terms extended far beyond the immediate destruction of East Anglia, fundamentally altering the political landscape of medieval England. Other Anglo-Saxon rulers, witnessing the complete annihilation of a once powerful kingdom, faced agonizing choices between resistance and accommodation that would shape the future trajectory of English development. The psychological impact of Edmund's martyrdom created a climate of fear and uncertainty that Viking diplomats would exploit in subsequent negotiations with other European monarchs. The transformation of the martyred king into a religious symbol represented an unexpected long-term consequence of Ivar's brutal retaliation that would continue to influence English culture for centuries. The cult of Saint Edmund, developing in the decades following his death, created a powerful narrative of Christian resistance to pagan authority that would inspire future generations of English rulers and common people alike. However, this spiritual victory came at an enormous material cost, as East Anglia never recovered its former independence or prosperity, serving instead as a permanent reminder of the price of defying Viking political ambitions. The brutal fate of King Edmund sent shockwaves throughout medieval Europe, creating a political climate where the mere mention of refusing Viking alliance proposals struck terror into the hearts of even the most powerful monarchs. The systematic destruction of East Anglia served as a masterclass in the consequences of diplomatic defiance, and Viking leaders across Scandinavia carefully studied and replicated the strategies that had proven so devastatingly effective against Edmund's kingdom. Within months of the East Anglian king's martyrdom, Norse emissaries were arriving at royal courts throughout Britain and continental Europe, bearing alliance proposals that carried with them the implicit threat of sharing Edmund's terrible fate. The psychological warfare aspects of Edmund's destruction proved to be equally as important as its immediate military objectives. Viking diplomatic missions began incorporating detailed accounts of the East Anglian king's final hours into their negotiations, using the story as a powerful tool for persuasion when presenting alliance terms to other European rulers. The vivid descriptions of Edmund's prolonged suffering, combined with evidence of his kingdom's complete obliteration, created an atmosphere of fear that often rendered actual military threats unnecessary. The mere presence of Viking envoys at foreign courts became sufficient to secure favorable diplomatic outcomes, as rulers across Europe weighed the benefits of resistance against the documented consequences of defying Norse political objectives. King Charles the Bald of Francia found himself confronting this new diplomatic reality when Viking emissaries arrived at his court in 870, barely a year after Edmund's martyrdom. The Frankish monarch, who had previously maintained an aggressive stance toward Norse expansion along his territories, suddenly discovered that his political calculations had been fundamentally altered by the East Anglian precedent. The Viking delegation, led by experienced negotiators who had witnessed Edmund's destruction firsthand, presented Charles with alliance terms that would have been unthinkable just months earlier. The proposed agreement included significant territorial concessions along the Seine River, tribute payments that would strain the Frankish treasury, and most significantly, formal recognition of Viking settlement rights in regions that had been considered inviolably Frankish for generations. The Frankish king's response to these demands revealed the profound impact that Edmund's fate had exerted on European diplomatic thinking. Rather than rejecting the Viking proposals outright, as he might have done previously, Charles entered into extended negotiations that ultimately resulted in the Treaty of Saclay-Sorepte, which granted substantial concessions to Norse leaders in exchange for their promise to cease raids against Frankish territories. The agreement represented a complete reversal of previous Frankish policy toward Viking expansion and demonstrated how Edmund's martyrdom had fundamentally altered the balance of power in medieval European diplomacy. Similar scenarios played out across the continent as the story of East Anglia's destruction spread through the networks of merchants, pilgrims, and diplomatic envoys that connected medieval European courts. King Louis, the German, faced comparable pressure when Viking forces approached his territories along the Rhine, finding that his nobles were unwilling to support military resistance given the documented consequences of such defiance. The German monarch's eventual capitulation to Norse demands for tribute and trading concessions represented another victory for the diplomatic strategy that had been so brutally demonstrated in Edmund's case. The transformation of diplomatic norms extended beyond individual treaty negotiations to encompass fundamental changes in how European rulers approached the question of Viking expansion. The concept of honorable resistance, which had previously motivated many medieval kings to reject foreign alliance proposals regardless of military odds, began to erode as practical considerations of survival took precedence over abstract principles of sovereignty. This shift represented a profound cultural change that would influence European political development for centuries, as pragmatic accommodation with superior force gradually replaced idealistic notions of unconditional resistance. The economic implications of this new diplomatic reality proved equally transformative, as kingdoms that had once competed fiercely with Viking trading networks now found themselves seeking integration with Norse commercial systems. The wealth and prosperity that had made East Anglia such an attractive target were now being systematically redistributed to kingdoms that had chosen cooperation over confrontation. Viking control over crucial trade routes, combined with their demonstrated willingness to completely destroy resistant territories, created powerful economic incentives for diplomatic accommodation that reinforced the political lessons of Edmund's martyrdom. The religious dimensions of this diplomatic transformation created additional complexities that European Christian rulers struggled to navigate. The martyrdom of King Edmund had created a powerful symbol of Christian resistance to pagan authority, inspiring religious leaders throughout Europe to preach against accommodation with Viking demands. However, the practical consequences of such resistance had been so devastatingly demonstrated that even the most devout Christian monarchs found themselves questioning whether martyrdom represented a responsible choice for rulers charged with protecting their subjects' welfare. This tension between religious principle and political pragmatism created internal conflicts within European kingdoms that Viking diplomats learned to exploit with remarkable skill. Norse negotiators became adept at identifying and exacerbating divisions between religious authorities who advocated resistance and secular nobles who favored accommodation, using these internal disputes to weaken potential opposition to their alliance proposals. The strategy proved so effective that many European courts began experiencing political crises whenever Viking diplomatic missions arrived, as different factions argued over appropriate responses to Norse demands. The long-term consequences of this diplomatic revolution extended far beyond the immediate political arrangements negotiated between Viking leaders and European monarchs. The fundamental shift in power relationships that began with Edmund's martyrdom would eventually contribute to the transformation of medieval European political structures, as traditional concepts of feudal obligation and royal authority adapted to accommodate the new realities of Norse influence. The integration of Viking political practices with existing European governmental systems created hybrid forms of administration that would influence the development of medieval statecraft throughout the continent. As we shall discover in the remarkable story of King Ethelbald of Mercia, even the most powerful Anglo-Saxon monarchs found themselves confronting impossible choices when faced with Viking alliance proposals that carried with them the implicit threat of sharing Edmund's terrible fate. The transformation of medieval European diplomacy had created a new world order where resistance to Norse political objectives had become virtually unthinkable, and accommodation represented the only realistic path to survival. The Kingdom of Mercia, long considered the most powerful of the Anglo-Saxon territories, found itself confronting the new diplomatic realities created by Edmund's martyrdom when Viking envoys arrived at King Ceolwulf's court in the winter of 873. The Mercian monarch, who had built his reputation on military prowess and political independence, suddenly discovered that his kingdom's traditional strength counted for little in the face of the psychological and strategic advantages that the Vikings had gained through their systematic destruction of East Anglia. The Norse diplomatic mission, led by seasoned negotiators who had perfected their techniques through successful campaigns across Europe, presented Ceolwulf with alliance terms that would fundamentally alter the character of his ancient kingdom. The Viking proposal to Mercia represented a sophisticated understanding of the kingdom's internal political dynamics and strategic vulnerabilities. Rather than demanding immediate territorial surrender or massive tribute payments, the Norse envoys offered what appeared to be a mutually beneficial partnership that would preserve Mercian administrative structures while integrating the kingdom into the expanding Viking political network. The terms included provisions for shared governance of key strategic locations, joint military campaigns against mutual enemies, and most significantly, gradual integration of Norse settlers into Mercian society through carefully planned colonization programs. King Ceolwulf's initial response to these proposals revealed the psychological impact that Edmund's fate had exerted on even the most confident Anglo-Saxon rulers. Unlike his predecessor's immediate and categorical rejection of Viking terms, Ceolwulf chose to request extended time for consultation with his nobles and religious advisors, a delay tactic that reflected both his awareness of the consequences of outright refusal and his hope that alternative solutions might emerge. This hesitation, while understandable given the circumstances, would ultimately prove to be a critical miscalculation that would seal Mercia's fate and provide Viking strategists with valuable insights into the psychological vulnerabilities of European rulers. The extended negotiations that followed demonstrated the sophisticated psychological pressure tactics that Viking diplomats had developed in the aftermath of their East Anglian success. Norse envoys remained at the Mercian court throughout the winter months, serving as constant reminders of their alliance proposals while systematically gathering intelligence about the kingdom's military capabilities, economic resources, and political divisions. The Viking delegation's presence created a climate of mounting tension and uncertainty that gradually eroded the confidence of Mercian nobles and religious leaders, many of whom began privately advocating for acceptance of the Norse terms. During these crucial months of negotiation, Viking forces elsewhere in England continued their campaigns against kingdoms that had chosen resistance over accommodation, ensuring that fresh examples of the consequences of defying Norse objectives regularly reached Ceolwulf's court. The systematic destruction of smaller Anglo-Saxon territories served as ongoing demonstrations of Viking military capabilities and political resolve, creating additional pressure for the Mercian king to reach a favorable decision regarding the alliance proposals. Each new report of devastation and conquest reinforced the lesson that had been so brutally taught through Edmund's martyrdom, gradually convincing even the most resistant Mercian nobles that accommodation represented their kingdom's only realistic option for survival. The internal political crisis that developed within Mercia during this period of extended negotiation revealed the destabilizing effects that Viking diplomatic pressure could exert on even the most stable European kingdoms. Traditional alliances between Mercian nobles began to fracture as different factions advocated for competing responses to the Norse proposals, with some arguing for immediate acceptance, while others continued to support resistance despite the documented consequences of such defiance. The kingdom's religious leadership found itself similarly divided, as some clergy advocated for martyrdom in imitation of King Edmund, while others argued that accommodation with pagan authority was preferable to the complete destruction of Christian institutions. King Ceolwulf's eventual capitulation to Viking demands, announced in the spring of 874, represented both a personal defeat and a broader transformation of Anglo-Saxon political culture. The formal alliance agreement that emerged from these extended negotiations granted the Vikings unprecedented access to Mercian resources and territory, while reducing the king to little more than a client ruler dependent on Norse support for his continued authority. The treaty provisions included massive tribute payments that would impoverish the Mercian treasury for generations, territorial concessions that granted Vikings control over key strategic locations throughout the kingdom, and most humiliatingly, formal recognition of Viking settlement rights in regions that had been continuously inhabited by Anglo-Saxon peoples for centuries. The implementation of these alliance terms revealed the true cost of Ceolwulf's delayed decision-making and demonstrated how Viking negotiators had used the extended negotiation period to maximize their strategic advantages. The Norse colonization program proceeded with ruthless efficiency, as Viking settlers arrived with detailed knowledge of Mercian geography, resources, and political structures that had been gathered during the months of diplomatic negotiations. The systematic displacement of Mercian landowners and the installation of Norse administrators in key governmental positions proceeded so smoothly that it became clear the Vikings had been planning these arrangements throughout the negotiation period. The psychological impact of Mercia's capitulation on other Anglo-Saxon kingdoms proved to be as devastating as the kingdom's actual military defeat would have been. The spectacle of the once mighty Mercian king, reduced to a puppet ruler dependent on Viking goodwill for his survival, demonstrated that even the strongest Anglo-Saxon territories could not resist the new diplomatic realities that had emerged from Edmund's martyrdom. The transformation of Mercia from an independent kingdom into a Viking client state provided a powerful example of how accommodation with Norse demands, while preserving the forms of royal authority, could result in the complete erosion of actual political independence. The broader implications of Ceolwulf's decision extended far beyond Mercia's immediate political situation, fundamentally altering the strategic balance throughout Anglo-Saxon England. The kingdom's resources and military capabilities were now effectively under Viking control, providing Norse leaders with unprecedented advantages in their ongoing campaigns against remaining resistant territories. The Mercian precedent also established new standards for alliance negotiations, as Viking envoys could now point to a successful example of how accommodation with their demands could preserve at least the appearance of royal authority while achieving their strategic objectives. As we shall discover in the tragic story of King Burgund's earlier reign and ultimate exile, even rulers who initially attempted to navigate the complex diplomatic landscape created by Viking expansion found that accommodation with Norse demands often led to consequences as devastating as outright resistance, though perhaps less immediately dramatic than the martyrdom that had befallen King Edmund in East Anglia. The winter of 874 marked a pivotal moment in medieval European history, when King Alfred of Wessex found himself confronting the ultimate test of the diplomatic revolution that had begun with Edmund's martyrdom. As the last major Anglo-Saxon ruler maintaining genuine independence from Viking influence, Alfred faced alliance proposals that represented the culmination of Norse diplomatic strategy and would determine whether any corner of England could preserve its political autonomy in the face of the systematic transformation that had engulfed the continent. The young Wessex monarch's response to these crucial negotiations would not only seal his kingdom's fate, but establish the final parameters of the new European order that had emerged from the ashes of traditional medieval diplomacy. The Viking delegation that arrived at Alfred's court carried with them the accumulated wisdom and experience of nearly a decade of successful alliance negotiations throughout Europe. These seasoned diplomats had witnessed firsthand the devastating effectiveness of the strategies that had been developed through Edmund's destruction and refined through subsequent campaigns against resistant kingdoms. Their proposal to Alfred represented the pinnacle of Norse diplomatic sophistication, offering terms that appeared to acknowledge Wessex's unique military capabilities while ensuring Viking strategic objectives would be achieved through political rather than purely military means. The alliance terms presented to Alfred revealed the extent to which Viking political thinking had evolved since their early raids and settlements. Rather than demanding immediate territorial concessions or massive tribute payments, the Norse envoys proposed a complex arrangement that would integrate Wessex into a broader confederation of Viking-allied territories while preserving substantial autonomy for Alfred's administration. The agreement would have established joint military commands for defense against external threats, created integrated trade networks that would benefit both Viking and Anglo-Saxon merchants, and most significantly, provided a framework for gradual cultural assimilation that would transform Wessex over generations rather than through immediate conquest. Alfred's initial response to these proposals demonstrated both his understanding of the new diplomatic realities and his determination to find alternatives to the stark choices of resistance or accommodation that had destroyed or transformed other European kingdoms. Unlike Edmund's immediate rejection or Ceolwulf's prolonged hesitation, Alfred chose to engage in detailed negotiations while simultaneously strengthening his kingdom's military capabilities and diplomatic options. The Wessex king's strategy reflected a sophisticated understanding that successful opposition to Viking expansion required not just military strength, but alternative political arrangements that could satisfy Norse strategic objectives without compromising Anglo-Saxon independence. The extended negotiations that followed revealed Alfred's remarkable ability to navigate the complex psychological and political pressures that had overwhelmed other European rulers. Rather than allowing Viking envoys to remain at his court as sources of ongoing pressure, Alfred established formal diplomatic protocols that limited Norse access to sensitive information while demonstrating respect for their representatives. The Wessex king's careful management of the negotiation process prevented the internal political divisions that had weakened other kingdoms and maintained Anglo-Saxon morale despite the obvious military disparities between his forces and the combined Viking armies. During these crucial months, Alfred implemented a revolutionary defensive strategy that would fundamentally alter the military balance between Anglo-Saxon and Viking forces. The construction of fortified towns, or burhs, throughout Wessex created a network of defensive positions that could withstand Viking siege techniques while providing secure bases for Anglo-Saxon military operations. This innovative approach to territorial defense demonstrated that European rulers possessed alternatives to either accommodation or martyrdom when confronting Viking expansion, provided they were willing to invest in new military technologies and strategies. The Battle of Edington in 878 represented the dramatic climax of Alfred's strategy and would ultimately validate his approach to the Viking diplomatic challenge. The comprehensive defeat of Guthrum's forces demonstrated that properly prepared Anglo-Saxon armies could successfully resist Viking military pressure, fundamentally altering the strategic calculations that had made accommodation appear inevitable for other European rulers. Alfred's victory provided concrete proof that the psychological advantages Vikings had gained through Edmund's martyrdom could be overcome through innovative military tactics and sustained political determination. The peace negotiations that followed Alfred's military triumph established entirely new precedents for European diplomatic relations with Viking powers. The Treaty of Alfred and Guthrum created a framework for coexistence that recognized legitimate Viking territorial claims while preserving Anglo-Saxon political independence within clearly defined boundaries. This revolutionary agreement demonstrated that European rulers could negotiate with Viking leaders from positions of strength rather than the weakness and fear that had characterized previous diplomatic encounters. The establishment of the Danelaw as a formal political entity represented a fundamental transformation of the European political landscape that had been brewing since Edmund's martyrdom. The recognition of legitimate Viking territorial authority within defined boundaries provided a framework for managing Norse expansion that satisfied their strategic objectives without requiring the complete subjugation of existing European political structures. Alfred's success in negotiating this arrangement from a position of military strength provided a model for other European rulers who had previously seen accommodation or destruction as their only options when confronting Viking expansion. The long-term consequences of Alfred's diplomatic breakthrough extended far beyond the immediate political arrangements negotiated at Wedmore. The demonstration that European rulers could successfully resist Viking pressure through innovative military and political strategies inspired similar developments throughout the continent, as other kingdoms began implementing defensive innovations and diplomatic approaches modeled on the Wessex example. The psychological impact of Alfred's success helped restore European confidence in the possibility of maintaining political independence despite Viking military capabilities. The cultural and religious implications of these developments proved equally significant. as Alfred's success provided Christian European rulers with an alternative to the martyrdom that had claimed Edmund or the accommodation that had compromised other kingdoms. The preservation of Christian political authority within Wessex, combined with the peaceful coexistence arrangements established with pagan Viking territories, created new models for religious tolerance and cultural exchange that would influence European development for centuries. The transformation of Viking expansion from an existential threat to a manageable political challenge represented a fundamental shift in medieval European thinking about cultural diversity and political accommodation. The establishment of stable political boundaries between Anglo-Saxon and Viking territories marked the end of the period of diplomatic terror that had begun with Edmund's martyrdom and the beginning of a new era of European political development. The success of Alfred's strategy demonstrated that the systematic intimidation tactics that had proven so effective in previous Viking campaigns could be overcome through proper preparation, innovative thinking, and sustained political determination. The transformation of Viking expansion from an unstoppable force to a negotiable political challenge represented, perhaps, the most significant diplomatic revolution in medieval European history. As the mists of time have settled over the dramatic events of the 9th and 10th centuries, the profound lessons embedded within these tales of diplomatic courage and political calculation continue to resonate through the corridors of history. The transformation of medieval Europe that began with the systematic intimidation following King Edmund's martyrdom and culminated in Alfred's revolutionary approach to Viking diplomacy established fundamental principles of international relations that would influence political development far beyond the boundaries of the Viking Age. The stories we have explored reveal the complex interplay between military capability, diplomatic sophistication, and psychological warfare that characterized this pivotal period in European development. The Vikings' mastery of these interconnected elements of statecraft created a political revolution that forced European rulers to abandon traditional concepts of royal authority and develop new approaches to sovereignty that could accommodate the realities of Norse expansion. The consequences of rejecting Viking alliance proposals, so dramatically illustrated through Edmund's fate and the transformation of kingdoms like Mercia, demonstrated the price of failing to adapt to changing political circumstances. Yet the ultimate legacy of this period lies not in the tales of destruction and accommodation, but in the demonstration that innovative thinking and sustained determination could overcome even the most overwhelming diplomatic and military pressures. Alfred's success in creating sustainable political arrangements with Viking powers while preserving Anglo-Saxon independence provided a model for principled resistance that transcended the false choice between martyrdom and capitulation. His achievements proved that European civilization possessed the intellectual and cultural resources necessary to adapt to external challenges without sacrificing its fundamental values and political institutions. The transformation of Viking expansion from an existential threat to a manageable political challenge represented one of medieval Europe's greatest diplomatic achievements. The establishment of the Danelaw and the successful integration of Norse settlers into European society demonstrated that cultural diversity and political accommodation could coexist with legitimate security concerns and territorial integrity. These arrangements created precedents for managing cultural conflict and political competition that would influence European development throughout the medieval period and beyond. The broader implications of these developments extended to fundamental questions about the nature of political authority, cultural identity, and international relations that remain relevant to contemporary diplomatic challenges. The Viking Age transformation of European politics demonstrated that lasting political solutions required understanding and accommodation of legitimate interests on all sides, rather than simple domination or submission. The success of diplomatic arrangements that recognized Viking territorial claims while preserving European political independence provided evidence that seemingly irreconcilable conflicts could be resolved through creative political thinking and mutual respect for strategic necessities. As we reflect upon these remarkable tales of political courage and diplomatic innovation, we are reminded that history's greatest lessons often emerge from periods of apparent crisis and insurmountable challenge. The transformation of medieval European diplomacy that began with the terrifying consequences of rejecting Viking alliance proposals ultimately led to more sophisticated and sustainable approaches to international relations that benefited all parties involved. The legacy of these developments continues to influence our understanding of how political communities can adapt to changing circumstances while preserving their essential character and fundamental values. The stories of Edmund's martyrdom, Mercia's accommodation, and Alfred's innovative resistance provide timeless examples of different approaches to diplomatic challenges and their respective consequences. These historical precedents remind us that political leaders face choices whose implications extend far beyond immediate circumstances, influencing the development of their societies for generations to come. The courage to resist when resistance serves legitimate purposes, the wisdom to accommodate when accommodation preserves essential values, and the innovation to find creative solutions to seemingly impossible challenges remain as relevant today as they were during the transformative centuries of the Viking Age.